What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next? The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. So over the course of the past 9 episodes, we've framed our discussion around Canada's federal poverty reduction strategy, and it's based on 3 foundational pillars: dignity, opportunity and inclusion, and resilience and security. And it's on that final pillar where we will focus this roundtable episode of the 2030 Project. Resilience and security are going to be the key components in the recovery and reckoning stages as we learn to live in this era of COVID-19. Nowhere will it be more important than in the workplace. What will our labor force look like? What will a career look like in the emerging gig economy? And where are the opportunities in the future of work to help us reduce, if not eradicate, poverty? Our guests for this episode are Pedro Barata. He's the Executive Director at Future Skills Center. Jessica Thorne is a principal and co-founder at Creative Futures. And Lisa Taylor is president at Challenge Factory. So let's start the conversation just in terms of your view, each of your views of the landscape for, labor markets, just the where we are in terms of the work environment, broadly speaking. Because 2 years ago, where we thought we might have had stable ground, right now we have all kinds of fissures, and we've got, cracks in the system. We've got parts that are collapsing or softening where we wouldn't have otherwise expected. Lisa, why don't you start us off? Give us what kind of a rocky state is this in right now?
I love that question. And I think the assumption that we were on solid ground 2 years ago is a really interesting place to start. So in 2019, a book of mine called The Talent Revolution was published just before everything hit. And what I find interesting about that is before the crisis happened, we were already in a revolutionary state in terms of the world of work and the relationship between workers, the labor market, longevity and demographics, some of the aspects of elements that we're seeing now. And then on top of a revolution, we added a crisis. And we've diverted our attention over the last 18, 24 months to addressing the crisis, which is right and what needs to happen. But meanwhile, the revolution has continued while we haven't been paying attention to it. And so this messy moment in time that you were just referring to is just at the moment where we're realizing, okay, the crisis is now moving towards the recovery stages, but things are still messy. And we now have to really contend with what have we learned through the crisis that actually helps us become better revolutionaries in how we shape the future of work.
So, Pedro, when we take that kind of that idea of the revolutionary element of it, I mean, let's talk about the landmines that now are in front of us that we're going to have to ignite and get them out of the way or avoid to some degree to maintain that momentum. What do you see?
Well, let's talk about technology, which certainly is at the heart of this conversation. In many ways, one of the buzzwords during this pandemic has become acceleration. And we always knew that, technology like AI automation was going to fundamentally revolutionize our workplace and our economy. And I think it's fair to say that we're just seeing that perspective being accelerated. Before the pandemic, if you go back to 2017, if it's possible to even put ourselves in that mindset, but the federal government's own Advisory Council on Economic Growth estimated that by 2030, automation would affect or threaten about 10% of jobs in the labor market. You fast forward to today, and just recently, McKinsey has upped that and said that 25% more workers than what we previously thought are likely going to need to switch occupations. That's a serious re-estimate, right, over the course of a relatively short period of time. And technology can be a force for good, certainly, in making our job quality and making our economy stronger. But we're going to have to be really deliberate in how we approach it, because it's already creating some significant disruption in sectors where, frankly, we have some of our most precarious workers employed, like retail, like hospitality. And it's actually in those places where we are likely going to see technology come in fastest to start to change those industries. And we're going to need some solutions that, frankly, start from those who are going to be the most vulnerable through that change.
Okay, I want to come back and sort of tie all that together in Lisa's revolutionary metaphor. But let's just get your sense of the landscape first, Jessica.
Sure, yes. I think I would echo a lot of what Lisa and Pedro have shared here in terms of what things were looking like a couple of years ago when we were thinking about where we were headed. We were doing some work at the Brookfield Institute as part of their Employment in 2030 initiative that was sort of trying to make sense of the massive amount of tech change impacting the future of employment, but also looking at some of the other changes as well. And so we were looking at social, environmental, and political changes that had the potential to also disrupt things. So back then, so that would have been 2018, we were looking at, the growing climate crises and flooding and forest fires, and how is that going to disrupt different industries and also people's ability to be productive? How was growing conversations about capitalism and the decline of capitalism potentially going to come into that narrative? How was people's sort of need to actually disconnect from technology because they were starting to have mental health challenges related to how much screen time people were having? How was that sort of impacting workers' perceptions of the jobs they wanted to do, but also actually disrupting industries in ways that we weren't necessarily part of the dominant conversation? And then fast forward to where we are now, and even more into the future, a lot of these conversations have also accelerated in terms of the conversation about the relationship between employees and employers and the value people get from work. And I think the pandemic has really shown us that employers, especially in some of these industries that were already, such as retail, that were already quite disrupted by tech or the potential to, have now been put into this position where things are more and more challenging. And so when we think about the future, we need to think about, the tech changes, but also how there's some values changes. People are thinking differently about their relationship with work and what they need out of life, what they have to have out of life. And I think as we look forward to this conversation about, building back better and people thinking about what jobs they want to do in the future, and so many big life changes, people are moving cities and making huge changes. Let's make sure that's not just the percentage of people who are spending this pandemic being able to buy expensive fitness equipment. Like, let's make sure that's a conversation that everybody gets to have, especially those who've been most disrupted.
Okay, so we've touched on a lot of things here, and I'm glad you brought up the whole idea of inclusion, because that's the whole point of this sort of exploration in the conversation against the backdrop of the national strategy to reduce poverty. And inclusion and resilience is a key component to that. But Pedro, when we start talking about AI, it immediately becomes a scary conversation. And it sounds as if there's nowhere to go but to circle the bowl. And I think that's a problem if we approach it that way.
Absolutely. I think we have the opportunity to look at the inevitability of all new technologies as a huge opportunity to drive our economy and to drive shared prosperity. But what we can't do is just, leave these technologies to their own devices and just get out of the way. What we can do is we can think about how is it that we're going to leverage technology to support people in doing what they need to do. And it's both little things and big things. And the little things is just our mindset, which Dave, you're pointing to. What is our openness to actually understand, embrace, leverage that change so that we are in control? One area of work, for example, where we at Future Skills Center are working with the University Health Network to look at what are the social and emotional barriers by frontline healthcare providers in just understanding AI as a force for potential good, in just triaging, understanding how people are healing, making better decisions that are supported by good technology in terms of streamlining some of the healthcare systems that that are going to continue to require more efficiency. But before we even get into the technical aspects of AI and how we're going to use it and building up the skills of the workforce on the front lines, we have to address the fact that people have certain values as caring professionals, and they don't want to see that compromised. They want to understand, like, how does this technology get used? Who's in control? Are there privacy concerns? Is it going to replace my job, or is it going to enhance my job? And if we pace this appropriately and we actually work with human beings to understand how they can leverage the technology, then it can be a force for good. But that has to be replicated right across so many sectors that are going to be seeing or experiencing their own challenges and opportunities around how technology is enabled. And with the right strategy, with us being deliberate in working with government around regulation, with employers around implementation, with workers around skills and training, with workforce development providers and being more demand-driven and client-centered, if all of these things start to come together in a strategy, then we can get out in front of it and we can actually be world leaders in adopting technology.
I really like what you're saying, Pedro, but I wonder if even in this conversation, we're not actually falling into the trap of shaping the future of work versus preparing for technology's impact on the future of work. So when technology is the headline and we fall into technological determinism, so just because technologies are existing, they have to be used and they're going to be put into place. And then we start going down the path of, okay, so how do we prepare for their impacts? Taking a human-centric approach, including values and making sure that we're bringing people along, we've given the headline to technology, as opposed to the headline being, what is the future of work? Where do we actually want human effort and energy to be exerted? What goals do we have as a society, as a company, as an industry, as a sector, whatever the lens is that you want to put to it, including the individual lens. Where do I want to be spending my time? Where does my identity and my effort come together in a way that's meaningful for me? And then from there, start to engage the technology discussion. So it's always interesting to me, having had a 12-year technology career, that it's really tangible to be able to talk about AI. But if we started the conversation from saying, well, what do we need people to be doing in our future economy? And then get to the technology discussion, I wonder if that helps flip the tables a little bit.
Does that kind of go back to what each of you has touched on, though, Lisa, and that is this emergence of our own focus, our whether it's a cultural focus or an individual focus on value and our own personal values. And that has changed my own approach to the work that I do and when I do it. And, or who's involved in it. So it's in a very subtle way, it has changed my approach. And I can see where there is value in that. At the same time, doesn't it risk slowing things down and making things a whole lot more complicated?
Well, one way I think that we can help to address that complexity is to expand the fields that we look to in terms of, where are there good models? Like, where has this been done well? And how can these questions be asked in a way that doesn't just become a free-for-all? And some people who have the time or the luxury or the resources to reflect on values gets to do that. And other people are left behind and just have to deal with what they're handed. And, I'm completely biased in this recommendation, but around the world, the countries that do this well have strong and robust career development sectors. And career development is not just your high school guidance counselor, although they're certainly a part of the system. But career development is a system that looks at the intersection of identity and work and learning from age 5, when children enter the formal school system, until 95 or 105, or whenever people decide that it's now time for them to withdraw from engaging within their communities. And that lifelong approach and the tools and the discipline, the formal methodologies, the PhD peer-reviewed analysis and theories gives a much more robust way of dealing with this concept of individuals and the world of work than coming at it from a project management perspective or a technology perspective or even a traditional human resources perspective.
So, Jessica, when we, the long view, yes, and I think we're going to have to take a long view of all of this. The challenge, though, immediately is the level of urgency that we have here. And we have seen more people who have fallen into poverty. We have more working poor in this country than we have ever had. And I talked to the folks at Daily Bread, and, Neil Hetherington will tell us that he's still seeing the effects of the 2008-2009 financial crisis in his shops. He fully expects that the pressures on social services, food banks, et cetera, will peak in about 3 years. So we are far from having the pandemic in the rearview mirror as far as this is concerned. So how do we balance this off in terms of dealing with, what is precarious work? We're hearing so much about, even the whole question of immigration has been brought up in the last week or so. Our immigration numbers are down. So all of a sudden we don't have the people that can fill the jobs, et cetera, where we may have otherwise. What's the first 2 or 3 buttons that we need to push to make sure this stays on the right track in the next 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is where, again, from my perspective, needs to be that balance between what do we need to react to right in this moment to support people, to make sure that people have what they need, but also how do we think about where we want to be in 10 years to make sure we're on the right trajectory. And I think this is where, when we think about where we could be in 2030, there are so many different possible futures of what that looks like. And some of those futures look worse. They look worse. They look like, yes, that 3-year peak could be even longer. And some of the futures could look really optimistic and like the future that we want. But if we don't have a good sense of what that is and exactly what it will take to get there, then that means that our decisions tomorrow aren't going to set us up in any better position to get there. And so there is need to balance that understanding and reacting to the urgency, but also really clear understanding of where do we want to go, where do we want to move the system, and how are we going to get there, and what is the policy changes that are needed, what are the collaborations that we need, how do we need to think differently about where we are today so we don't keep reinforcing where we are today into the future. And so I think there is that need to balance.
One of the conversation threads that's happened throughout this series has been around policy, and we have set government policy to address certain social issues and the needs of those who are particularly in need. And there's a well-intendedness about that policy. But often, we've talked about in this series, it gets in its own way. So it makes it more difficult for someone who is on social assistance to actually get off social assistance and get a job. So it's not just about getting a job. There's a much broader view here. So I'd be curious to get each of you to kind of give me a sense of, there will be a conversation, and I think a serious and a necessary one, about basic income. At some level, there's going to be one. Pedro, how does that, let's assume that, for example, for a minute, that we get to some form of basic income that's institutionalized in this country, national program. How does that change or shift the lens as far as your view of the future of work is concerned?
It's a great question. And why don't we look at that from the point of view of a very real discussion that's happening right now about employers who are having a hard time finding workers to do jobs that, frankly, have traditionally been at the lower end of the job market, right? Mm-hmm. So right now we're hearing a lot about how retail and hospitality, right, back to work, and people are not coming back. I don't know how basic income helps with that issue, but I think it's a very blunt tool. I think we need to actually look at who are the people who are unemployed, and to ask the right questions about how disability impacts that, the rise of mental health, right? And there's been a huge rise of mental health during the pandemic, but even in sectors like hospitality and retail, like a real emergence of a conversation about working conditions. Let's talk about wages and even knowing what your schedule is going to be next week, and how is it that we actually raise the floor so that we do get on a path of shared prosperity. So I think that if we look at what that package is, that includes both the wages that you get from your job, the help that you need with your housing. If you're a parent, affordable childcare that actually allows you to go to work and where, your entire paycheck is not taken up in just like your kids being taken care of. Mental health supports in the community, which you refer to, are going to only continue to rise. I think that that's a much more dynamic and frankly responsive way to support people who are all very different than to just jump to, we're going to give you a basic income amount. Everybody's different. We know that people are going to be moving through just different stages in their own career. Like all of us, this is not going to be an issue with just the precariously employed anymore. Many more of us are going to be facing life decisions, career changes, and we're going to need specific bespoke supports through that. And I think policy needs to become more responsive to the needs of people. At the same time that we don't cut off also the reality that employers are going to need workers to show up and feel like they're valued, they're well taken care of, and that their needs are being met.
Yeah, Lisa, I think that the two things come out of what Pedro just said, and that is, the idea of prosperity is one thing, balancing that off against the other P word, which is productivity, and how do we balance those two things. But my sense of the basic income conversation is that no one is saying that is a lone tool in the toolkit. It's a component in the whole picture, just as new skills development is going to be part of that. An awareness of, sick benefits or those sorts of things that we're going to have to really drill down on and look at. And I'd be curious to ask you, based on that, I realize it's been part of the conversation before, but probably no more and has never been accentuated or highlighted as much as we've seen now. And we're going to have to deal with it in terms of the future of work and the workplace.
I think what happens in these conversations is that they're big topics and they become like this big ball of twine. And when you start to pull a thread, all that you end up doing is just creating a tighter and tighter knot. And there becomes all kinds of dimensions to this. One of the things that I like to do is to use different filters to break down what exactly is it that we're talking about. And there's 5 that I use when I'm thinking about the future of work. And so the first one is demographics and longevity. So if we wanted to use basic income as a tool and run it through a bit of analysis so that we can actually get to speaking practically about how could it be used, what are the pitfalls, what should we be thinking about, how is it a tool to shape the future, the first lens we can run it through is demographics and longevity, who's included and who's not. What demographic-based disparities does it cause, unintended? What does it help, intended or unintended? What should we be paying attention to? The second is career ownership. So how does it relate to an individual owning their own future and feeling connected to the work that they're doing in a way that's appropriate for them? What's the relationship between employer and employee? All of those questions become a part of the career ownership discussion. And then we get into the freelancing gig economy. So how does guaranteed basic income impact to accelerate or decelerate or change the nature of the discussion when we're talking about gig work? Then we start to shift into some of the more technology-based discussions around what platform-based models exist to help connect workers. The labor market's a market after all, so supply and demand. What are the platforms that help make sure we're looking at this with the whole market in mind? And then the last filter that I would run it through is what are the technologies that support this? So technology for me is always last because it exists and it's going to be there. We will get to the conversation, but it's not where it starts. Instead, we need to take a look at things like guaranteed basic income, the impact of environmental change, the pandemic itself, mental health. All of these topics can be run through those 5 filters so that we start to get a picture of, okay, we have a demographic-based issue. We're going to shift the relationship between employer and employee. It's going to impact the gig economy this way, which translates to less or more precarious work. And then here's how technology plays a role. Then we can get to practical discussions where we can test and see, does that feel right? Is that the direction we want to go in? Instead of it being this big ball of twine of guaranteed income, but are people going to go back? And what's the motivation? And are they not coming back because they've received CERB? Or is it perhaps that learning has changed and they've upgraded their skills? It becomes too hard to discern what's actually happening, what's leading, and what's following until we have a model to be able to apply.
Yeah, I guess, Jessica, we're in a place where it's, unprecedented. Well, I hope soon that we can just stop using that word at some point. But, we don't have a model. And quite frankly, we're almost living in what is a live petri dish now on so many levels. This is a live experiment. The worry I have in all of this, and you've all focused on the key elements, is that people will look at this and say, this is too big a problem for me, and I just kind of I can't do this anymore. I'm trying as best I can, but I'm not going to be able to fix the employment market for those who are out there. So let's just throw more money in the social assistance side of things.
What isn't complex these days? I think it's like,
right.
We talk about growing levels of uncertainty and complexity, and it just feels like every day it's more, and the mental toll on everyone, it's growing and growing. And so I think it is, I hear you on that comment. I think a lot of people are feeling that, but at the same time, it is a big system. And I think Lisa made a really good point of like, you need to follow those threads. And so understand, what if, what then? But I think to Pedro's point too, you need to really understand and talk to people about what is it that people need. And I think going back to your original question about, policy and getting it right or getting it wrong, I think at the end of the day, this is a really complicated space. And the more that we can break this down and actually talk to people who are most impacted directly about what it is they need and what it's going to take, then you can start to understand. And even if it starts small, it could seemingly start small, but it's a way to start to work away at that system. And I think that at the end of the day, when you think about something like, universal basic income, or how people are maybe not wanting to get back to work because the work isn't great, or the work isn't, what they need, or they actually can't because they need to be home because they're dealing with childcare issues that are just so much more complicated than they were before. It's really complicated. And so the more we can talk to people, because at the end of the day, the labor market is people, and we need to understand where they're at and what they need to be able to support and participate in this. And I think that's it's a challenging piece to do, because it feels like, how can I talk to 5 people and move a ginormous system? But actually you can talk to 5 people and get really helpful insights that could really help you move the system. And so I guess that would, it's a big system. It's really complicated, but if we can start smaller and start with people, I do think there could be some leverage points.
One point of optimism that I've seen is, Challenge Factory has been focused on the future of work for 10 years. The conversation is now everywhere. So if the starting point is everyone in every sector at every level with all different jobs having different kinds of conversations about how work is impacting their life, for good or for bad, and just the realization that there are changes that need to happen. I mean, I think that's the very first step. The fact that it's a dining room table conversation now, that was not true 5 years ago. It was not true. It was the subject matter of conferences, and, certain people were spending time talking about it. Now everyone's talking about it. And I think that gives us a really good opportunity for optimism, especially in the area, Jessica, of what you're advocating for, which is basically everybody has a role to play in voicing what they need. And then the system needs to be able to have a way to catch those needs and discern what's a crisis need that needs to be addressed right now, and what's a revolutionary need that's going to take some time. And how do we transition from where we are now to there and not get confused along the way, so that we ignore the people in crisis while we're chasing the revolution. I think that's the trick. And I think we can do that.
So let me start then with you before we go, Lisa, and that's going to require a certain amount of permission and a certain amount of leadership, or perhaps a combination of both in some cases. Where does that happen?
That's a very good question. And in all of the client work that we've been doing over the last number of months, we've started to notice a trend. And the trend is that there are 2 characteristics of leadership that are being called for right at this moment. And the 2 characteristics that we're seeing over and over and over again is trust and courage. We need leaders at all levels, and Canadians at all levels, to really focus on fostering trust, and bolstering courage. And those are the two things that we need to see. And in terms of what level of leadership do we need to see that from? We need to see that from the frontline manager that's having career conversations with their staff every day without complete information, all the way up to the highest levels of our government that's setting out policy. Trust and courage.
Pedro, it's a skill that we don't necessarily often talk about when we talk about skills development, but it's and I use the phrase permission because at some point we need to give permission to that frontline worker that Lisa describes to be able to say out loud to the manager or the supervisor, here's my experience, and have the courage to do that. And so I think we really need to be encouraging that. There's a skill set in leadership that we really haven't seen a whole lot of.
There's so many bellwethers, and you just named one, right? That we saw workplaces, especially those workplaces that were on the front lines, or delivering critical consumer services, really like rally together and figure out new business models under stress that showed just incredible resilience of a workplace from the top to the very bottom. And hopefully what emerges out of that is a sense that solutions do need to come and leadership does need to come, and that courage needs to come from all parts of the organization, and it should be valued. It should be valued. I will add on to Lisa's optimistic list on that front, in that just recently we're seeing from the right to the left of the political spectrum leading thinkers come forward and to say that one way that we really need to value our workforce is to make sure that, a hard day's work leads to a pathway out of poverty. And that, if employers can't carry the whole can, it's the role of public policy together with employers in a worker-centered way to make sure that the benefits are there, that the wage top up is there, the childcare is there, and that we actually need to work together to figure out how is it that we value people and we keep their heads above water and we allow them to be part of shared prosperity. I think that takes an incredible amount of courage to actually do that, because it's sort of breaking old ideological paradigms. I even think at the agenda that the federal government now has in front of it, and there's a lot of it which speaks to this, implementing a pan-Canadian childcare system. It's about time. Looking at EI reform. EI reform is kind of like the beachhead for how we look at how we're going to expand income benefits and training opportunities for more and more people. And we have been on a path where we've been rationalizing that and cutting off people from the supports that they need in an increasingly flexible workforce. We actually need to go the other way and open that up. We have an opportunity to actually hit that conversation in a way that recognizes, let's value people who increasingly are going to be going through changes in their lives.
So, yeah, and I'll let you take this where you want, just to close on a final thought, Jessica. But as both Lisa and Pedro frame this for me, the courage and the trust element is critical, obviously. Understanding and acknowledging someone's value and contribution, so giving them permission to step up and feel confident that that's going to be good for everybody. My sense of this is that we are probably going to have to rely more on the private sector and the nonprofit sector to step up and do this and show real leadership, to illustrate that this is why it's important. Governments will fall in line. We're at risk if we rely on government to take the lead on this. But I'll let you take it where you want to go.
That's interesting. I think part of this is about thinking about leadership and what that means and what type of leadership we need. And Lisa, I love that point about trust and courage. I think that's so true. But I think part of it is also, to Pedro's point about we're all in this together, is that we all have a leadership role. And so I think waiting for, one sector or another or one organization or another to lead the way, I think what we need to do is really push a narrative that is actually on every single person to change and move this forward. And I think the more that people can feel their own courage to take leadership as we move the system, the better, because it isn't going to take one sector or one government. It has to be a collaborative, collective effort, and we need to collectively understand why it's so critical. And so I think this goes back to, we need to create these visions of understanding of where do we want to be in 10 years And how are we going to collectively make this happen and not wait for someone else to do something? Because I think a lot about how, people were saying, oh, thank goodness 2018 is over. 2019 is going to be better. And then it was, oh, thank God 2019 is over. 2020 is going to be the year. And then we learned that actually, maybe we need to think differently about this. Maybe we need to stop waiting for the better year and actually making tangible steps so that it is getting better for more people.
I think you've just launched us off on a whole new podcast series here. So this was Pedro, Jessica, Lisa, thanks for joining us today. It was an important start to an important conversation.
This was great. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Pedro Barata, he's the executive director at Future Skills Center. Jessica Thorne is a principal and co-founder at Creative Futures, and Lisa Taylor is president at Challenge Factory. Next week, we'll wrap up this podcast season of the 2030 Project and review what we've learned over the course of the series. And we'll set some expectations in this renewed mission to reduce poverty by 50% by the year 2030. Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is an Eye Contact production.